Now, personally, I like to get estradiol tested. Sure, you can look at all forms of estrogen, but specifically estradiol. I like to look at that between days 19 and 21. So really like 5 to 7 days prior to someone getting the first day of their bleed. And I like to look at this relative to the progesterone ratio. Estrogen plays a key role in determining where body fat is stored. Now, when estrogen levels are too high or too low or otherwise imbalanced, it can lead to fat redistribution as well as a slew of other systemic effects. Now, when we're talking about its role in fat storage, estrogen does help regulate fat storage specifically to subcutaneous areas like the hips, thighs, particularly in women. Now, this is part of the female fat distribution pattern. Estrogen also supports insulin sensitivity, meaning it helps the body produce more glucose effectively and reduces the likelihood of storing fat in these visceral areas. Now, when estrogen is low, so think end of a fat loss phase for someone on hormonal birth control, or end of a contest prep, or someone who is chronically stressed to a point that they're experiencing amenorrhea or REDS. When estrogen is low, fat shifts away from the hips and the thighs to the abdomen, increasing that visceral fat gain. Insulin sensitivity decreases, making the body more likely to store fat unfavorably. Low estrogen also contributes to sarcopenia, so muscle loss, reducing metabolism, increasing fat storage. Now, why does this happen? We typically see estrogen levels decline during perimenopause or menopause. So I often see women going through perimenopause at much earlier rates, at much earlier ages, on account of an extensive history of perma-dieting and under-recovering. Now, in men and women, chronic stress, poor diet, extreme caloric deficits, specifically in like relative energy deficiency in sports, that can suppress estrogen levels. Now, what about in the case when estrogen is too high? So there are two types of estrogen dominance. We have absolute, which is where estrogen levels are just simply too high. They're out of range, so over 150. And I would say for the most part, I see people working well between 75 and 150. Relative dominance is when estrogen levels might be within range technically, but progesterone levels are too low, even though that estrogen is technically normal. Now, relative dominance is when progesterone levels are too low to oppose what we would consider normal estrogen levels. So you could still be between 75 and 150, yet it's the fact that the progesterone is not rising adequately enough to offset them. Now, high estrogen, this can lead to insulin resistance, lipoprotein lipase activity, specifically in abdominal areas, as well as low-grade inflammation. These are all things that are going to tie seemingly to that visceral fat gain and excess water retention. Now, we also see that high estrogen levels increase the production of TBG, so thyroid binding globulin. This is a protein that binds to thyroid hormones, so T4, T3 in the bloodstream, making them unavailable for cellular use. Now, this reduces the amount of active free T3. So this makes it to where your thyroid begins to function at a slower rate. We also see that high estrogen levels can cause water retention, leading to a feeling of bloating and weight gain independent of fat accumulation. Now, when we talk about causes of estrogen dominance, we've got environmental estrogen, so plastics, cosmetics, pesticides, cleaning products that can mimic estrogen. Got poor liver function, so we need to ask, is this an input or is this a functional issue with another system? So with the hepatic system, is the liver metabolizing and detoxifying excess estrogen the way it's supposed to? Or do we have downregulated hepatic function that can then lead to the accumulation of estrogen? Gut dysbiosis, an imbalanced gut microbiome can impair estrogen elimination through the GI tract, leading to reabsorption in the bloodstream. This is something that we call enterohepatic circulation. And then we have to consider the role that hormonal birth control can play. I mean, synthetic estrogens in contraceptives, they can exacerbate estrogen dominance by suppressing natural hormone production. The big things that we can do: dietary changes, lifestyle adjustments, and medical interventions as needed. For those dietary changes, making sure that we're eating foods that support estrogen detoxification, such as broccoli, kale, cauliflower. If we are looking at fiber-rich foods to bind to excess estrogen, this needs to be a baseline across all of our systems. We see an improvement in overall health markers, getting in an adequate, a very reasonable amount of fiber per day. So for women, that can be 20 to 35 a day. For men, that can be 35 to 40, depending on body weight. What we need to understand about estradiol is that the values, the serum values that we're getting, have different meanings depending on where you are in your cycle. There are very much times where we want levels to be on the lower end, and there are times where we want them to be on the higher end. Yet, without context relative to what your normal cycle looks like, or if you're not having a normal cycle, gaining regularity there, that can be a huge game changer in parsing out and figuring out why some of these imbalances are occurring.